My name is Tom Reynolds, and if these weathered hands could talk, they'd tell you stories that would make your heart race and your eyes well up with tears. I've lived 80 years on this earth, and for 45 of those years, I called the open road my office, my church, and sometimes my salvation. Born in 1944 in a small town outside Cleveland, Ohio, I've seen America change from the ground up, literally. I've watched cities rise from farmland, witnessed the birth of the interstate highway system, and felt the pulse of this great nation through the vibration of my steering wheel. They call me a trucker, but I prefer to think of myself as a keeper of American stories. You see, when you spend nearly half a century behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, crisscrossing this beautiful country from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Canadian border down to the Rio Grande, you don't just transport cargo, you transport dreams, hopes, and sometimes heartbreak from one corner of America to another. I've hauled everything from fresh produce that fed families thousands of miles away to construction materials that built the homes where children took their first steps. I've carried Christmas toys in December and school supplies in August. Each load wasn't just freight to me. It was a small piece of someone's life, someone's future. But this isn't just a story about trucking. It's a story about love that lasted 60 years, about raising a family while living half your life on the road, about the brotherhood you find in truck stops at 3 a.m., and about the profound loneliness that can hit you when you're driving through Nebraska at sunset, thinking about everyone you love who's hundreds of miles behind you. This is a story about sacrifice and reward, about missing your daughter's school play because you're delivering medicine to a hospital in Texas, but also about being there to teach your grandson how to drive stick shift in an empty parking lot when you finally came home. Most importantly, this is about my final ride, that last coast-to-coast journey I took at 65 with my grandson Billy riding shotgun, when I finally understood what all those miles had taught me about life, love, and what really matters when you reach the end of the road. So buckle up, friend. We're about to take a journey through 8 decades of an American life, lived on 4 wheels, and fueled by diesel dreams and determination. I came into this world on March 15th, 1944, in Akron, Ohio, during the middle of World War II. My father, Henry Reynolds, was somewhere in the Pacific fighting the Japanese when I took my first breath. My mother, Margaret, was just 19 years old and scared out of her mind, raising a baby while praying every night that her husband would come home in one piece. Those early years were tough. Mom worked at the Firestone tire plant during the day, and our neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, watched me. I learned to walk in her kitchen while she baked bread and told me stories about the old country. Food was rationed, money was tight, and every knock at the door could bring news that would change everything forever. When Dad finally came home in 1946, I was 2 years old and didn't recognize this stranger in the green uniform who made my mother cry happy tears. He was different, quieter, jumpier, with eyes that seemed to look at things the rest of us couldn't see. The war had marked him, the way it marked an entire generation of men who came back with stories they'd never tell their children. Dad got a job at the steel mill, working the night shift. During the day, he'd sleep fitfully in the bedroom with newspapers taped over the windows to block out the sunlight. Sometimes I'd hear him talking in his sleep, calling out names of buddies who didn't make it home. Mom would gently wake him, and he'd sit on the edge of the bed for a long time, just staring at his hands. Money was always tight, but we had love. Sunday dinners were sacred in our house. Mom would make pot roast if we were lucky enough to afford it, or beans and cornbread when times were leaner. Dad would carve the meat with the same precision he used for everything else, and we'd say grace together. Those were the moments when the war seemed far away, when our little kitchen felt like the safest place in the world. School was a struggle for me, not because I wasn't smart. I could figure out most anything if you gave me something to work with my hands, but because sitting still in those desks felt like torture. I look out the classroom window and wonder what was beyond those streets, beyond our neighborhood, beyond Ohio itself. The teacher would call my name, and I'd be somewhere else entirely, riding the rails or sailing the seas or driving down roads I'd never seen. I found my escape in the garage behind our house. Dad taught me how to fix things, first bicycles, then lawn mowers, then cars. My hands learned the language of engines before my brain fully understood it. There was something magical about taking apart something that was broken and putting it back together so it worked better than before. By the time I was 14, I was the kid in the neighborhood everyone came to when their bike chain broke or their father's car wouldn't start. I charged a quarter for small jobs, 50 cents for bigger ones, and I saved every penny in a coffee can hidden under my bed. That money represented something more than just coins and bills. It represented freedom, possibility, and maybe a ticket out of Akron someday. The transition from childhood to adolescence brought new challenges, but it also brought the first glimpse of the man I would become. High school in the late 1950s was like living in two different worlds. There was the world inside the classroom, where teachers talked about algebra and history dates, and there was the real world outside, where guys my age were already thinking about Vietnam, about jobs, about the girls who made our hearts pound like jackhammers. I was 16 when I first laid eyes on Mary Catherine O'Brien. She was sitting in the school library, her red hair catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows, reading a book about faraway places. I must have walked past that table 20 times before I finally got the courage to ask if the chair across from her was taken. "It is now," she said with a smile that knocked me sideways. Mary came from the Irish side of town, where families were big and loud, and everyone knew everyone else's business. Her father worked construction, and her mother took in sewing to help make ends meet. She was the third of 7 children, which meant she knew how to hold her own in any argument and could stretch a dollar further than anyone I'd ever met. We started dating in the spring of my junior year. I'd pick her up in Dad's old Buick when he wasn't using it for work, and we'd drive to Miller's Pond or the drive-in movie theater. She'd pack sandwiches, and I'd bring a thermos of coffee I'd stolen from Mom's kitchen. We'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. Her dreams of seeing the ocean, my fascination with the big trucks that rumbled through town carrying cargo to places I could only imagine. Mary was the first person who didn't think I was crazy for wanting to see what was beyond the horizon. While other girls our age talked about settling down in Akron, raising families in the same neighborhoods where they'd grown up, Mary understood that some people were born with wheels in their souls instead of roots in the ground. The summer between junior and senior year, I got a job at Patterson's garage downtown. Old man Patterson had been fixing cars since before I was born, and his hands looked like they'd been carved from the same leather as his work gloves. He taught me things they'd never teach in school. How to listen to an engine and know what was wrong just by the sound it made. How to feel a problem through the vibration in a wrench. How to make something last longer than it was supposed to. But more than mechanical skills, Patterson taught me about work ethic. "Boy," he'd say, wiping his hands on a rag that had been cleaned sometime during the Eisenhower administration, "a man's worth isn't measured by what he knows. It's measured by how hard he's willing to work to learn what he doesn't know." That philosophy would carry me through the rest of my life. Senior year flew by in a blur of football games, school dances, and long conversations with Mary about our future. I'd already decided I wasn't college material, not because I couldn't handle the books, but because I couldn't handle 4 more years of sitting still when the whole world was out there waiting to be explored. The week before graduation, I proposed to Mary with a ring I'd bought using every penny from my coffee can savings plus 3 months of wages for Patterson's garage. We were sitting by Miller's Pond, watching the sunset paint the water orange and pink, when I pulled that little velvet box from my jacket pocket. "Mary Catherine O'Brien," I said, my voice shaking worse than Dad's old Buick on a cold morning. "Will you marry me and help me figure out what's on the other side of every hill we haven't climbed yet?" She said yes before I even finished the question, and we spent the rest of that evening planning a life neither of us could fully imagine, but both of us were brave enough to want. The foundation of our love story was built on adventure, trust, and a shared belief that life was meant to be lived fully, not just safely. We got married on June 22nd, 1963, in St. Patrick's Catholic Church on the Irish side of town. Mary wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and I wore a suit I'd bought secondhand and pressed so many times the creases could have cut glass. The whole ceremony cost less than $50, but it felt like the most important event in the history of the world. Our honeymoon was a 3-day trip to Niagara Falls in Dad's Buick, which broke down twice. Once in Erie, Pennsylvania, and once just outside Buffalo. Each breakdown turned into an adventure. While I fixed whatever was wrong under the hood, Mary would explore whatever small town we'd landed in, coming back with stories about the people she'd met and the interesting things she'd discovered. "You know what I love about you? Tom Reynolds," she said as I was elbow deep in the engine outside a diner in Pennsauken. You don't see problems. You see puzzles to solve. We set up house in a tiny apartment above Kowalski's Bakery on the east side of Akron. The smell of fresh bread woke us up every morning, and Mrs. Kowalski would slip day-old pastries under our door when she knew money was particularly tight. Our furniture was a collection of hand-me-downs and garage sale finds, but Mary had a gift for making any space feel like home. I was working full-time at Patterson's garage by then, and Mary got a job at Woolworth's downtown. We were both putting in 50-hour weeks, but in the evenings, we'd sit at our little kitchen table and plan our future. Mary would spread out road maps, and we'd trace routes with our fingers, talking about all the places we wanted to see together. That's when I first started seriously thinking about long-haul trucking. The drivers who came into Patterson's for repairs had stories that made my imagination run wild. They talked about watching the sunrise over the Rocky Mountains, about truck stops in Texas where the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, about highways that stretched to the horizon in every direction. You're thinking about it again, Mary would say, catching me staring out the window when a big rig rumbled past our apartment. Am I that obvious? Tom, you get the same look in your eyes when you see those trucks that most men get when they see a pretty woman. She wasn't wrong. There was something about those 18-wheelers that called to something deep in my soul. Maybe it was the freedom, maybe it was the adventure, or maybe it was just the simple fact that driving truck meant you were always going somewhere instead of staying in the same place forever. In the fall of 1964, our first child was on the way. Little Sarah would arrive the following March, and suddenly our conversations about adventure and exploration had to include discussions about diapers and doctor bills, and how to provide for a family on a mechanic's salary. That's when Patterson made me an offer that changed everything. He had a contract to haul auto parts to dealerships across Ohio and Pennsylvania, and he needed someone reliable to drive one of his trucks. The pay was better than what I was making in the garage, and I'd be home most weekends. Think about it, he told me, but don't think too long. Good opportunities don't wait around forever. I talked it over with Mary that night. She was 6 months pregnant, her belly round with our first child, and she looked at me across our tiny kitchen table with those green eyes that could see right through to my soul. You want this, she said. It wasn't a question. I want to provide for our family. Tom Reynolds, don't you dare use us as an excuse. If you want to drive truck, then drive truck. Just promise me one thing. What's that? Promise me that no matter how far those wheels take you, you'll always remember the way home. It was a promise I would spend the next 45 years learning how to keep. 3 weeks later, I was behind the wheel of my first big rig, pulling out of Patterson's lot with a load of brake pads bound for a dealership in Pittsburgh, my heart pounding with excitement and terror in equal measure. Learning to drive an 18-wheeler is like learning to dance with a partner who weighs 40 tons and doesn't forgive mistakes. My first few months on the road were a combination of white-knuckle terror and pure exhilaration. Every hill felt like a mountain, every curve felt like a death trap, and every successful delivery felt like a small miracle. Patterson started me on local routes, Ohio to Pennsylvania and back, occasionally down to Kentucky or up to Michigan. I'd leave Monday morning and be home by Friday night, just in time to help Mary with whatever needed doing around the apartment and to feel our baby kick against her growing belly. Sarah Elizabeth Reynolds was born on March 3rd, 1965, at 6:47 in the morning. I was in the waiting room at Akron General, pacing holes in the linoleum floor, when Dr. Mitchell came out with a smile bigger than Christmas morning. It's a girl, Mr. Reynolds. Mother and baby are both doing fine. When they finally let me into the room, Mary was holding this tiny, perfect human being who had somehow come from us, but was completely herself. Sarah's eyes were closed, her little fists were clenched, and her hair was the same red as her mother's. She's beautiful, I whispered, afraid that speaking too loud might break the magic of the moment. She's ours, Mary said, and those 2 words contained more love and hope and responsibility than I knew existed in the world. Being a father changed everything and nothing all at once. I still loved the road, still felt that pull every time I saw highway signs pointing toward distant cities. But now I had something even more important pulling me home. Every mile I drove was a mile that brought me back to Sarah's laugh, to Mary's smile, to the life we were building together one day at a time. The trucking industry was changing in the mid-1960s. The interstate highway system was expanding, connecting cities in ways that made long-haul trucking more efficient and profitable. Patterson was getting contracts to haul loads further and further from home, and he needed drivers he could trust to represent his company hundreds of miles away from his garage. "Tom," he said one afternoon as I was backing up to the loading dock, "how would you feel about taking a load to California?" California. The word hit me like lightning. I'd never been further west than Indiana, and here was Patterson offering me a chance to drive all the way to the Pacific Ocean. When would I leave? Monday. It's a load of farm equipment going to Fresno. Should take you about 4 days to get there, a day to unload, and 4 days back. You'd be gone about 10 days total. 10 days away from Mary and baby Sarah felt like 10 years, but the opportunity was too good to pass up. This was my chance to prove I could handle the big leagues of long-haul trucking. Mary understood, the way she always understood. "Go," she said, bouncing Sarah on her hip while I packed my duffel bag. "But you call me every single day, and you bring me back something from California that I can't get in Ohio. What would that be?" Surprise me. That first cross-country run taught me lessons I'd carry for the rest of my career. I learned that the United States is impossibly big and incredibly small at the same time. I learned that truck drivers were some of the most generous, helpful people you'd ever meet, always ready to give directions, share coffee, or help a fellow driver who was having trouble. I learned that a good CB radio conversation could make the loneliest stretch of highway feel like a community. Most importantly, I learned that Mary had been right. No matter how far the road took me, I always knew the way home. When I got back from California, I had a seashell from Santa Monica Beach in my pocket and a new understanding of what I wanted to do with my life. By 1967, I was running regular routes from Ohio to Texas, California, Florida, and everywhere in between. Sarah had grown into a toddler with her mother's red hair and her father's stubborn streak, and Mary was pregnant again. Our little apartment above the bakery had gotten crowded, so we moved into a small house on Maple Street with a yard where Sarah could play and room for the baby that was coming. James Henry Reynolds, named after both his grandfathers, arrived on a snowy December morning, 2 weeks before Christmas. Where Sarah had been a calm, quiet baby, Jimmy was all energy and noise from the moment he entered the world. The doctor said he'd never seen a newborn with such strong lungs. "He's going to be a talker," Mary predicted, and she was right about that too. Having 2 children changed the dynamics of my time on the road. I couldn't just be gone for days at a time without thinking about what I was missing at home. Sarah was starting to walk and talk, and Jimmy was growing and changing so fast that I'd sometimes come home to find he'd learned something new while I was hauling steel to Atlanta or produce to New York. Mary never complained, but I could see the tiredness around her eyes, the way she'd sometimes just sit quietly at the kitchen table after the kids were asleep, staring at nothing in particular. Raising 2 babies while your husband is gone half the time isn't easy, and Mary was handling it with more grace than I probably deserved. The trucking industry was booming in the late 60s. The economy was strong. America was building and consuming and moving goods from coast to coast at a pace nobody had ever seen before. For drivers who were willing to work hard and stay safe, there was more work than we could handle. Patterson's fleet had grown from 3 trucks to 12, and he was talking about expanding into refrigerated hauling. "The future is in fresh produce," he told me. "People want strawberries in January and lettuce that was picked yesterday. That means keeping things cold from California to New York." I started training on refrigerated trailers, learning how to manage temperature controls, how to handle the extra weight of the cooling equipment, how to deal with the special challenges of hauling produce that could spoil if anything went wrong. It was more complicated than dry freight, but it paid better too. My first reefer load was lettuce from the Salinas Valley in California to a distributor in Cleveland. 3 days of driving with one eye on the road and one eye on the temperature gauge, praying that the cooling unit wouldn't break down somewhere in the desert. When I backed up at the dock in Cleveland and opened those trailer doors to see row after row of perfect, fresh lettuce, I felt like I'd accomplished something important. The children were growing. Mary was managing our household like a general commanding an army, and I was learning that success in trucking wasn't just about driving skills or mechanical knowledge. It was about reliability, about being the guy who could be trusted with valuable cargo, about building relationships with dispatchers and customers who knew that when Tom Reynolds said he'd be there Tuesday morning, he'd be there Tuesday morning. But success came with sacrifices. I missed Sarah's first day of kindergarten because I was stuck in traffic in Chicago. I missed Jimmy's first steps because I was delivering furniture to Phoenix. I missed anniversary dinners and birthday parties and quiet Sunday mornings when the whole family could just be together. Mary kept a calendar on the kitchen wall where she'd mark the days I was gone with red X's and the days I was home with blue circles. Some months, there were more red marks than blue ones. Do you ever regret this? I asked her one evening, looking at that calendar. Regret what? Marrying a man who's gone more than he's home. She thought about it for a long moment, the way Mary always did when I asked her something important. Tom, I knew who you were when I married you. I knew you had wheels in your soul. The question isn't whether I regret it. The question is whether you're happy. I was happy, but happiness in trucking always came with a price. The 1970s brought changes to our family and to the trucking industry that nobody could have predicted. Sarah started school and showed signs of being every bit as smart as her mother, while Jimmy developed a fascination with anything that had wheels and an engine. Mary took a part-time job at the school district to help with expenses and to give herself something that was completely her own. The oil crisis hit the trucking industry like a sledgehammer. Diesel prices went through the roof, and suddenly every mile had to be calculated not just for time and distance, but for fuel efficiency. Independent operators were going out of business left and right, and even established companies like Patterson's were feeling the pinch. We're going to have to be smarter about this, Patterson told his drivers during a meeting in the garage. No more deadheading unless absolutely necessary. No more taking the scenic route. Every gallon of fuel costs money we don't have to waste. I learned to drive differently during those years, coasting down hills instead of riding the brakes, timing traffic lights to avoid unnecessary stops, planning routes that minimized empty miles. It wasn't just about getting from point A to point B anymore. It was about doing it as efficiently as possible. The CB radio became even more important during the fuel crisis. Drivers shared information about which truck stops had the cheapest diesel, which routes had the least traffic, which way stations were open or closed. We looked out for each other because we all understood that we were in the same boat, fighting the same battles against rising costs and shrinking profit margins. In 1974, our third child arrived. Michael Thomas Reynolds came into the world during a particularly busy time. I was in the middle of a run to Seattle when Mary went into labor, and I had to turn around in Denver and drive straight through to make it home in time. I walked into the hospital, still wearing my work clothes, smelling like diesel and road dust, just as the doctor was cleaning off our newest son. Cutting it kind of close, aren't you, Dad? The nurse said with a smile. Mike was different from his older siblings from the start. Where Sarah was thoughtful and Jimmy was energetic, Mike was observant. He'd sit quietly and watch everything that happened around him, taking it all in with those serious dark eyes that seemed to see more than a baby should see. With 3 children and a mortgage, the pressure to stay busy and keep earning increased dramatically. I started taking longer runs, sometimes being gone for 2 weeks at a time. The money was better on the long hauls, but the cost of family life was significant. Sarah was becoming more independent, walking to school with the neighbor kids and helping her mother with household chores. Jimmy was all boy, constantly getting into things, building forts in the backyard, asking a million questions about trucks and engines and why Daddy had to go away so much. When I grow up, he announced one evening at dinner, I'm going to be a truck driver just like Dad, but I'm going to take my family with me. Mary and I exchanged a look across the table. The innocence of that statement hit us, both in ways we couldn't quite explain to a 6-year-old. The mid-1970s also brought deregulation discussions to the trucking industry. The government was talking about changing the rules that had governed freight hauling for decades, and nobody was quite sure what that would mean for drivers like me who had learned the business under the old system. Change is coming whether we like it or not, Patterson warned during another garage meeting. The question is whether we adapt to it or get run over by it. I started thinking more seriously about my long-term future in trucking. I was 30 years old, in good health, with a growing reputation as a reliable driver who could handle any kind of freight to any destination. But I was also a father of 3 who was missing too much of his children's lives. Mary and I had long conversations during those years about what we wanted our family to look like, what kind of father I wanted to be, and how to balance the demands of providing for a family with a need to actually be present for a family. Those weren't easy conversations, but they were necessary ones that would shape the decisions I'd make in the years to come. The late 1970s and early 1980s were a time of dramatic changes in both the trucking industry and our family life. Deregulation became reality in 1980, and suddenly the trucking business was a whole new game. More companies could enter the market, rates became more competitive, and drivers had more opportunities, but also more uncertainty. Patterson decided to expand his operation, adding more trucks and taking on contracts with major retailers who needed reliable transportation for their growing supply chains. The big boys are going to squeeze out the small operators, he predicted. So we either get bigger or we get gone. I was selected to be one of Patterson's senior drivers, which meant better routes, more responsibility, and the chance to train newer drivers who were just learning the business. Teaching young drivers how to handle an 18-wheeler safely and professionally became one of my favorite parts of the job. The truck doesn't care how tough you think you are, I tell the rookies. It doesn't care how much of a hurry you're in or how tired you are. Respect the machine, respect the road, and respect the other drivers out there, and you'll have a long career. Get careless or cocky, and you'll have a short one. At home, our children were growing into distinct personalities. Sarah, now in high school, was talking about college and careers that had nothing to do with trucks or engines. She was interested in nursing, drawn to the idea of helping people heal. Jimmy, in middle school, was still fascinated by anything mechanical and spent every free moment in the garage, learning to work on cars and small engines. Little Mike was turning out to be the athlete of the family. By age 7, he was playing baseball, football, and basketball, showing natural coordination and competitiveness that reminded Mary of her brothers back in Ireland. The challenge was that my work schedule made it difficult to be consistently present for their activities. I'd promised to be at Sarah's school play, or Jimmy's science fair, or Mike's baseball game, then get a call about an urgent load that needed to be delivered across the country. "It's okay, Dad," Sarah would say when I had to miss something important. "We understand." But the understanding in her voice carried a note of resignation that broke my heart a little every time I heard it. Mary had gone back to work full-time by then, taking a position as a secretary at the insurance company downtown. She said it was to help with college expenses, but I knew it was also because she needed something that was entirely her own, something that didn't depend on my schedule or my presence. We were financially stable for the first time in our marriage, but financial stability had come to cost of family time. I was earning more money than ever before, but I was also gone more than ever before. Some months, I'd be home less than a week total. The trucking community became my second family during those years. The other drivers, the dispatchers, the mechanics, the dock workers, we all understood each other in ways that outsiders couldn't fully grasp. We shared the same challenges, the same frustrations, and the same satisfaction that came from moving America's freight safely and on time. CB radio culture was at its peak during the late 70s and early 80s. Every driver had a handle. Mine was Ohio Tom, and the airways were constantly alive with conversations about traffic conditions, weather reports, speed traps, and general philosophy about life on the road. Some of my best memories from those years involved pulling into a truck stop at midnight, tired from a long day of driving, and finding a group of drivers gathered around a picnic table, sharing coffee and stories about where they'd been and where they were going next. There was a camaraderie among long-haul drivers that was unlike anything else I'd ever experienced. But even with the brotherhood of the road, there were lonely moments. Driving through Kansas at 3 a.m., when the only lights visible were your own headlights and maybe a farmhouse in the distance. Sitting in a truck stop parking lot on Christmas Eve, eating a sandwich from a vending machine while other families were gathering around their dinner tables. Those were the times when I questioned whether I was making the right choices, whether the freedom of the road was worth what it was costing me at home. The mid-1980s brought both triumph and tragedy to our family in ways that tested everything we thought we knew about ourselves and each other. I was at the peak of my career, running premium loads for major companies, earning respect throughout the industry as a driver who could be trusted with the most valuable and time-sensitive freight. Sarah graduated from high school as valedictorian and earned a scholarship to Ohio State University's nursing program. The night before she left for college, we sat on the front porch talking about her future and mine. "Dad," she said, "I want you to know that I understand why you had to be gone so much. I understand that you were working hard to give us opportunities you didn't have. But I miss so much of your childhood. Honey, I miss too many important moments. You miss some moments, but you were present for the ones that really mattered. And more importantly, you taught me that work has dignity, that providing for your family is a noble thing, and that sometimes love means sacrifice. Those words meant more to me than any compliment I'd ever received about my driving. Jimmy was in high school by then, and his fascination with mechanics had evolved into genuine skill. He could diagnose engine problems by sound, rebuild a transmission by feel, and had already decided that he wanted to follow in my footsteps as a trucker. Mary wasn't entirely happy about that decision. "One truck driver in the family is enough," she'd say, but I could tell she was proud of Jimmy's mechanical abilities, even as she worried about him choosing a career that would take him away from home. Mike was developing into a serious athlete, particularly in baseball. He had natural talent, good coaching, and the kind of work ethic that reminded me of myself at his age. Scouts from high schools across the state were already talking about him as a prospect worth watching. The tragedy came on a rainy Tuesday in October 1986. I was delivering electronics to a warehouse in Memphis when I got the call that would change our family forever. Mary's voice was shaky, barely controlled. "Tom, you need to come home. There's been an accident." Jimmy had been driving with some friends to a football game when their car hit a patch of black ice and went off the road. The other boys were injured but survived. Jimmy didn't make it to the hospital. I drove 18 hours straight from Memphis to Akron, running on adrenaline and grief and a desperate need to be with my family. By the time I walked into our house, the reality of what had happened was starting to sink in. Our middle son, our mechanical genius, our future truck driver, was gone at 17 years old. The funeral was held on a Saturday, which meant most of the trucking community could attend. The parking lot of St. Patrick's Church was filled with big rigs, and the church was filled with drivers who had driven hundreds of miles to pay their respects to Jimmy and support our family. Patterson gave the eulogy, talking about Jimmy's curiosity, his skill with engines, and his excitement about someday joining the family business. "He was going to be one of the great ones," Patterson said. "We've lost not just a fine young man, but a future leader of our industry." Grief changed all of us in different ways. Mary threw herself into her work and into supporting other families who had lost children. Sarah channeled her sorrow into her nursing studies, determined to help people heal. Mike became more serious, more focused, carrying what felt like the weight of being the surviving son. And I questioned everything about the choices I'd made, the time I'd spent away from home, and whether the life I'd built was worth what it had cost us. The road, which had always been my refuge, became a place where grief rode shotgun with me on every mile, where every truck stop conversation reminded me of the son who would never grow up to share those conversations with me. Here I am at 80 years old, sitting in my favorite chair in the living room of the house on Maple Street where we raised our children, where we celebrated birthdays and Christmas mornings, where we learned to live with joy and sorrow in equal measure. Mary passed away 3 years ago, after 60 years of marriage that taught me everything worth knowing about love, commitment, and grace under pressure. She died peacefully in her sleep, and I believe with all my heart that Jimmy was waiting for her on the other side. Sarah became a nurse, just like she planned, and spent 35 years caring for patients at Cleveland Clinic. She married a good man, raised 3 wonderful children, and never forgot the lessons about compassion and service that began in our little house above the bakery. Mike earned a baseball scholarship to Ohio State and played professionally in the minor leagues for several years before becoming a high school coach. He's taught hundreds of young men not just about baseball, but about character, perseverance, and the importance of teamwork. And that final ride with my grandson Billy, Mike's oldest son, when I was 65 years old, that was the ride that made sense of everything that had come before. We drove from Ohio to California and back, 3 generations of Reynolds men sharing the cab of an 18-wheeler, talking about life and dreams and the lessons that only the road can teach. Billy is 25 now, and he's chosen a different path than trucking, but he carries with him the same curiosity about the world, the same work ethic, and the same understanding that America is a big, beautiful, complicated place that's best understood 1 mile at a time. Looking back on 8 decades of life, 45 years of trucking, and all the joy and sorrow that filled the spaces between the miles, I've learned that home isn't a place you leave and return to. It's something you carry with you wherever the road takes you. And the most important cargo you'll ever haul isn't merchandise or produce or manufactured goods. It's love, responsibility, and the memories that make a life worth living. The road taught me that America isn't just a country, it's a promise. A promise that if you're willing to work hard, treat people with respect, and never give up on the people who matter most to you, you can build something meaningful out of whatever circumstances life hands you. Every mile I drove was a mile toward understanding that the journey matters just as much as the destination. Every sunrise I watched come up over a new horizon was a reminder that each day offers fresh possibilities. Every conversation I had with a fellow driver in a truck stop at midnight was a lesson in the fundamental decency of ordinary people doing necessary work. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Life is a long-haul journey, not a sprint. There will be breakdowns and detours, unexpected weather and road construction that forces you to find new routes to familiar destinations. But if you keep your eyes on the road, your hands steady on the wheel, and your heart focused on what really matters, you'll find your way home. The engine of my trucking career shut down years ago, but the memories still run strong, and the lessons learned on a million miles of American highway continue to guide me every day. That's the real freight I carried all those years. Not the cargo in the trailer, but the wisdom gained from a life lived in motion, always heading toward the next horizon, always finding the way back home.